There is no doubt that oil is one of the most powerful commodities in the entire world. It's hard to believe that people are willing to die for this liquid mixture of hydrocarbons that are made up from the remains of prehistoric animals and plants. However, recent history has shown us again and again that this is very much the case. Not only does oil fuel our cars as gasoline and diesel fuel, our boats as marine diesel oil, and our planes in the form of jet oil, allowing us to travel from place to place with a convenience and speed unprecedented throughout all of human history. But this amazing resource is also a main ingredient in items that you likely didn't even realize, such as cosmetics, nylon and polyester clothing, and even plastic. Yeah, that new gaming console sitting on your desk at home partly started as an ancient animal carcass. Freaky to think about, huh? What's more, kerosene and gas oil, two different forms of oil, keep our houses warm during the long winter months. A quality that may not seem so important for those in a place like Florida, yet a quality that I can say firsthand is an absolute necessity up here in Western New York. All of this leads directly back to the quote at the beginning of the video, given by Senator John McCain. He said, "Whoever controls the oil controls much more than the oil." Oil is everywhere in our lives, and most of us couldn't imagine a world without its products. Therefore, whoever controls the supply of oil has the ability to tear at the very fabric of a vast number of national economies. Senator McCain understood this, like many others in governments across the world, and thus, this is the reason that we see nations and companies expend so much effort to secure this so-called black gold. Speaking of companies with a hand in the supply of oil, that leads me directly into my next topic. In terms of demand for oil, the largest players are ones that are rather straightforward. The road transportation sector demands about 50% of all oil, whereas the petrochemical, residential/commercial/agricultural, and aviation sectors all follow not so closely behind, with 14.96%, 8.98%, and 7.75% of demand respectively. On the other hand, the history of the companies that dominate the supply of the oil industry is a rather interesting one. You see, in the early to mid 1990s, oil prices were at an all-time low and still declining due to the market being one that had nearly perfect competition. Unfortunately, these record low prices made profiting in the oil industry almost an impossibility, and this drove the companies in the oil industry to join forces. They knew that if they could eliminate some of the competition by combining with them, they could artificially drive up the price of oil with their newfound market power. And in 1998 and the years following, this is exactly what happened. Oil companies all over merged to form 6 titans of the oil industry. Titans that still rule over the market for oil to this very day. The first company to be born from this massive wave of merging was BP Amoco plc of England, which was formed in December of 1998. Now simply called BP plc, it currently sits at 4th place among the world's largest oil companies, and it raked in a whopping $298.75 billion in 2018. Next up in the string of mergers was France's Total SA in September of 1999, which currently sits as the 6th most valued oil company with $209.36 billion in revenues. 1 month after this came the US's own ExxonMobil, which currently sits a spot ahead of Total SA at 5th place with $290.2 billion. The follow-up to this was the emergence of Chevron, another US oil company which was created in September of 2001 and ranks as the 7th oil company in terms of revenue at $158.9 billion. Subsequently came yet another US-based company, ConocoPhillips, which was formed in August of 2002 and now exists as an offshoot of itself in Phillips 66, which also happens to rank 10th on the list with 111.46 billion in revenues. Lastly, the Royal Dutch Shell Company was formed in July of 2005. Based in the Netherlands, this company comes in at the highest yet ranking of second place, with 388.37 billion in revenues. Another notable aspect of the list is that the top of the list is actually dominated by firms based in China. China holds the first place spot with the China Petroleum and Chemical Corporation, also known as Sinopec, and the third place position as well with the China National Petroleum Corp, CNPC, with astounding revenues of 426 billion and 346 billion respectively. From this data, it is clear that the Chinese oil corporations are currently lapping the competition in terms of supplying oil, but how do the national oil exports of China stack up with other countries around the globe? When examining the list of countries that lead the world in exports, it becomes increasingly clear that the list shapes up the way it does overwhelmingly because of the natural reserves of oil which have been found within these nations' own confines. In a world where everyone is scrounging for the precious resource that is oil, countries aren't exactly apt to let other countries come in and take their reserves of oil for free. Another large factor in the list is having the necessary technology available to actually access the resource on your own. The ability to hydrofrack specifically has boosted several countries on this list as it allows them to access oil that would otherwise be unavailable to them. Thus, the list shapes up as follows. Saudi Arabia is the top exporter with 133.6 billion US dollars worth of oil exports in 2019, accounting for an impressive 13.3% of all crude oil exports. Second is Russia with 121.4 billion US dollars worth of oil exports, which accounts for 12.1% of all oil exports. Astoundingly, those two countries alone make up over a quarter of the entire global exports of crude oil. I would also like to slightly extend beyond the top 5 to make note of the United States' position on this list. The US comes in at 6th place with a total of $65.3 billion in crude oil exports, 6.5% of the world total. Now, let's flip to the other side of the equation, imports. The list of world leaders in terms of crude oil imports is quite a different story from the list of exporters, and it is as follows. China with 238.7 billion US dollars worth of crude oil imports, or a mind-blowing 22.6% of the global total. The US follows with 132.4 billion or 12.5%. India with 102.3 billion or 9.7%, Japan with 73.1 billion or 6.9%, and South Korea with 70.2 billion or 6.6%. Examining this list, the first thing that stands out to you is just how much China imports oil compared to the rest of the world. It's hard to internalize that they import nearly double the amount of oil that the second place country does, while in terms of crude oil exports, they don't even make it to the top 10. In fact, the only one of these nations that does crack the top 10 for exports is the United States, but even then they import twice as much oil as they export. The sheer amount of money these nations are spending on foreign oil shows you just how much power a country is granted when they have a significant supply of this resource, and just how devastating a systematic shutdown of the global market for oil would truly be. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of crude oil, the part that directly impacts you and I on a daily basis. Let's talk prices. It's often hard to wrap your mind around collective figures such as total exports and imports, and what exactly trends in those figures indicate for the common person. But speaking to the individual's wallet is something that we all understand. Over the past 5 years, crude oil prices had been relatively stable. Emphasis on had. Up until 2020, crude oil prices were averaging at about $53 per barrel, peaking at $77 per barrel, and getting as low as $37 per barrel. Now, there is a fair amount of disparity between those two figures. However, the changes between them were not sudden. They happened gradually. Then, in 2020, as some might say, a bit of a historical world event occurred. One which tested mankind's skill of sitting indoors for hours on end while doing absolutely nothing. Not to brag, but a skill that I'd say I'm rather good at.
Oh, I made myself sad.
But as I remained motionless in my room for an amount of time that even monks would be disturbed by, oil prices did exactly the opposite. In the span of 1 month from February to March, oil prices dropped by over half of their previous price, free falling from $45 per barrel to just $21. This type of a sudden drop may seem surprising at first. However, it makes a lot more sense once you take into account the drop in travel observed in all of the world's largest economies due to the fear of spreading COVID. And these declining oil prices led to billions of dollars in revenue losses for all of the major players in the oil industry. Thankfully, oil prices have been trending upwards since they reached their lowest price of $19.14 in April. During the last 30 days specifically, oil prices saw a slight dip again as oil companies in the United States braced for another mandatory lockdown. Yet prices have since evened out at around $41 as of recording this video. The Great Quarantine of 2020 is just one of many major events whose impact has been felt throughout the world of oil. Even in just the past 10 years, there have been a plethora of events that have significantly shifted the supply and demand of oil. To help paint a better picture of exactly what effects these events have had on oil, I'm going to use this here chart to depict the effects on the market. Let's start by examining on the graph the scenario which I have already detailed. As you see here, the worldwide stay-at-home orders are an external factor which shift demand specifically to the left. At this new level of demand, both the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity of oil are lower than they were previously. Now let's use the graph to look at some of the other events that have occurred. The first of these being the development of hydrofracking in the early 2010s. Hydrofracking was a game changer in the oil industry as it allowed nations to access shale oil for the first time, an enormous amount of which was virtually untapped at that point. Reserves of this shale oil were found and subsequently accessed all over the United States specifically. In this scenario, the external factor of new hydrofracking technologies shifted the supply of oil to the right, which increased the equilibrium quantity of oil while simultaneously lowering the price. The final recent event, which I will discuss, is a war. Well, not a war in the traditional sense. Following the development of hydrofracking, oil production in the US was booming, and the US began climbing up the list of top oil-producing countries worldwide. Saudi Arabia was particularly displeased with this development, as they desperately hoped to hold on to the power that oil had granted them up to this point. And as a result, they began a price war. Knowing that hydrofracking is an expensive procedure, that is to say, it can only be profitable when the price of oil is high, Saudi Arabia convinced OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, to flood the oil market, lowering the price of oil past the point of profitability for oil obtained through fracking. Demonstrating this effect on the graph once again, the flooding of the oil market sanctioned by OPEC is an external factor that shifts the supply of oil to the right significantly, sharply lowering the equilibrium price while raising the equilibrium quantity. So far over the course of this video, I have spoken extensively about the past and present of crude oil, so naturally, that leaves the future to be discussed. And in the case of crude oil, depending on whether you look towards the immediate future or the distant future, two very different stories are revealed to you. If I were an investor looking to get into the oil industry for the short term, I would do so as soon as possible. Experts are projecting that oil prices will spike by 115% by the end of 2020. These experts recognize that once the pandemic comes to a close, the world should once again start seeing normal rates of travel, meaning more demand for oil. That is a level of almost guaranteed profit that you'd be hard-pressed to find in many other commodities. However, once the oil prices do spike, I would immediately sell any stock you own in it and never look back. For if you do not take that opportunity, the future for oil prices is one that looks quite bleak. With growing concerns over the effect of burning fossil fuels on the environment, nations all over the world have begun consciously making decisions that limit the amount of carbon dioxide they are emitting. Many have already partly abandoned coal in favor of renewable resources such as solar, wind, and hydro energy. And oil is certainly next up on the proverbial chopping block. Electric cars have already started popping up everywhere, with brands such as Tesla being very profitable while selling these more eco-friendly cars. Furthermore, experts predict that as early as the year 2030, electric cars will outsell conventional gas-guzzling ones completely. Oil may undoubtedly always have a place in world economies. Nevertheless, it looks as though its role will diminish more and more in the coming years, making it difficult to justify any long-term investment in the oil industry.